So, today we're going to be talking about imperialism in Asia. We've already discussed the scramble for Africa and how all the European countries were trying to gather resources in Africa. But a lot of the same stuff happened in Asia as well. And so, I kind of want to go over some of this information for you. So, first, I know this is a little fuzzy, but you kind of get the idea. This is how imperialism broke down in Asia by 1914. And you guys have already done this map. You can see Great Britain is the red, green is France. So they've all kind of spread out. Pink is independent, meaning they were their own country, they ran their own government. So let's start with imperialism in Asia with India. And that's where some of the beginnings of imperialism started. So, who controlled India in the early mid 1800s? Well, primarily it was the East India Company, which was basically a large corporation that did a lot of trading from London to India. So, spices, teas, that kind of thing. It's actually the same company when you think of the Boston Tea Party that the colonists, dumped all the tea in the harbor. That was tea owned by the East India Company, and so they were very upset by it. So the East India Company, which was controlled by Britain, was in charge of a large area of India, and they kind of treated it like their own private colony. Like they thought they owned that area. And they even had their own flag and crest and everything. And they dominated trade in that area and really to all of India. They were pretty much the only company and the only country that could trade with India in that capacity. The rest of India was ruled by local rulers, so it was kind of like small counties almost with their own government, their own villages had their own rulers. And so as the East India Company grew and Britain's hold grew, they started to take over more and more control of land in India. So then we have the Sepoy Rebellion, and this was a fight between the Sepoys and the British in 1857. And Sepoys are Indian soldiers that are serving under British orders. So they're soldiers that are born in India, from India, that are serving basically for the British Army. And they were really upset for several reasons. But one of them is that they were starting to get upset that the castes were mixed. They had a caste system in India where it was kind of like a higher ranking, different classes of people were grouped differently and treated differently based on a higher caste was considered superior, like a superior race almost, or a superior group, ethnic group, however it was divided within that region. So they started having this tension. They're really upset that Britain is basically trying to control everything they do and that Britain is changing the way that India has always been run. So, one of the things that really kind of set them off is that the Sepoys were given weapons to fight for the British Army, and bullet cartridges in their firearms were coated in like cow or pig fat. And in an effort, or the way that you had to open these cartridges at the time is you kind of put it in your mouth and you had to pop it open. And the Indian religions don't believe in touching or consuming these parts of an animal. And so they basically felt like their religion was being attacked and their rights were being violated. And this fighting broke out between the Sepoys and the British. And in the end result, Great Britain basically puts down the rebellion, tells them we've had enough of this, and they gained control over all of India until 1947. There's kind of like this second mutiny, and what it did was it got rid of the East India Company, but it allowed all of Britain to take over all of India, which was basically counterproductive or the opposite of what the Sepoys were wanting at the time when they launched this rebellion. So there were many effects of British rule. Some of them were good and some were bad. If you look at the good, they started building more roads and bridges. There were railroads, telegraph lines. They kind of built up the empire, built up the country, and helped modernize it. They introduced them to modern medical innovations, some new farming techniques, and it led to the creation of an Indian nationalist movement. Basically, kind of got them started thinking about, or got a political party started thinking about independence someday and how they could fight for that. But again, there are negatives to being ruled by another country. First of all, the British thought of themselves as superior. They believed that the Indians were second class citizens. So even though you're born and raised in this country, you're not valued as much as the British people that had come in and taken over. The British in India were also given a higher status than the native Indians had in their own country. So again, that's part of that superior thing. You were given more responsibility, often more wealth, more control. And their economy was geared towards helping Britain's economy. So all this money that the country's bringing in, they have to give towards Britain because that's who owns them, basically. They're a colony of Britain now, so they have to give that money, and they're not growing as they needed to. So next, we're going to move over to imperialism in Asia in China, which was an independent country. So prior to imperialism, China was a very powerful, productive country in Asia. They had a large army, they had a lot of goods, and by the 1800s, they had over 300 million people, but they were pretty self sufficient. They didn't really rely on trade. They kind of had everything they needed within their own country. And they were kind of excluding much of Europe. They didn't want to trade with Europe. In their own opinion, Chinese goods were better than everyone else's goods. Um, and they didn't want to be corrupted by European influence because when a country takes over, you pick up some of their habits. It's why many people in India know English because they were taken over by Britain and they picked up those habits. So the Chinese wanted to maintain their own culture, maintain who they were, and not be influenced by other countries. So they really refused to trade. And Britain was really upset about this because what China had that you couldn't really find in Britain was porcelain, silver, and silk. And they knew they needed China to be willing to trade with them in order for them to get those goods. And so it became this thing where we have to figure out what China needs that they'll be willing to trade. Find something that we can convince them that trade is necessary. And that's where they discovered opium. If you're not aware, opium is a very addictive narcotic drug. And China had pretty much eliminated it by law. They didn't want their citizens to be using opium, to consume it, or to have any influence with it. Opium is a plant, you can see it down here in this corner, that is found in India. And nowadays, to give you an idea of how strong this is and what it is, it's the same product that's used in things like morphine. You know, when you give people that are severely wounded or in surgery to like basically knock them out. It's in codeine, which is a painkiller, and it's in heroin. So this is a very, very strong narcotic. And so you could understand why the Chinese government wants to outlaw it. They don't want it to change their people or how people act or behave. They can see the clear negative effects. So to get around this law and this legal restriction, Britain started smuggling opium into China and trading with people. And so obviously the Chinese people that were consuming this became addicted to the drug, and then they needed more. And so they were willing to trade with Britain. They were willing to do anything for it. And that completely angered the Chinese government, and war broke out. And that's called the Opium Wars. That was in Great Britain versus China between 1839 and 1842. It lasted for quite a while. But basically, China wanted to stop Britain from bringing opium into their country. And they tried to do some negotiations. They tried to get them to stop, and it just wasn't working, and war broke out. And the end result was that Great Britain was able to win very easily. China had to sign the Treaty of Nanking, which basically said that Europe could trade around much of China. It opened up a lot of port cities, saying that they had the right to trade wherever they wanted. Britain was able to get control of Hong Kong, some of the major cities. And then it actually forced China to have to pay for all the opium that they damaged. So China pretty much got the worst end of the deal here. They didn't really get any kind of peace treaty. It was like, hey, now Great Britain can do whatever they want. So then, as it opens up and Europe has some influence, they have what's called the sphere of influence. And a sphere of influence is a country or an area in which another country has power to affect developments, but they don't have authority. So you can kind of see that means like orange here is Britain. While Britain is not colonizing in there and China is still independent, Britain has no government control here. Their ideas, their people are there, and so they're spreading their own culture in that area. They're influencing the decisions and the trade that's happening in that area. Just like right here, France was having a major influence on what was happening in that part of China. But they did not have any government control of that time. And this is actually a quite famous comic strip. When we think of comic strips, it's not the same as it used to be, or as we think of it now. We think of something humorous. A lot of times back at this time, comics were more meant to be like a political commentary. And so you can see this says Sheen. It's a French comic, and Sheen is how you say China in French. So these people are all standing here and they're carving up China. And you have the emperor of China up here, or the ruler of China, Manchu Jing, who's like saying, stop, stop, what's happening? And I know you might not recognize who these people are, but this woman right here is supposed to be Queen Victoria I of Great Britain. And then you have Kaiser Wilhelm II of Germany. This person is Tsar of Russia. His name is Nicholas II. This is a Japanese samurai or a Japanese leader. And this person, they call her Marianne. She's basically the symbol of France. And so, while it wasn't necessarily a French ruler, it's the person that represents France. So it's showing all these rulers and leaders of each country that are trying to take over China and to make it their own. So the China fights, you have a couple of them. The Boxer Rebellion was the Chinese were starting to resent the European presence in China after the Opium Wars, as they, more and more Europeans came into China. And again, they wanted to hold on to their culture. And so you have this group called the Righteous and Harmonious Society. And they called themselves Boxers because they were very skilled in martial arts ability and fighting. And so it's like a secret society dedicated to getting rid of all the foreign influence, all the foreign presence in China. And there were several organizations like that, but the Boxers became the most famous. And in 1900, the Boxers started fighting with Europeans in like little mini wars throughout the country, trying to free China from all the Europeans. But basically, the end result, the Boxers were easily defeated because they didn't stand a chance against all these European armies, and ideas of nationalism still grew. People still had pride in China and what was happening. There's also the Taiping Rebellion. This was a civil war in China. It was fought between the Manchus and this group called the Kingdom of Heavenly Peace. And in the end result, the Manchus won, and it was considered one of the bloodiest civil wars in history. And there's several different estimates of how many people died. And our final group is Imperialism in Asia and Japan. So prior to imperialism, what was Japan like? It had this policy similar to China of isolationism with the Tokugawa shogunate in the 1600s, where we are going to preserve our own culture. We don't need anybody else. We can kind of do our own thing. And they had very limited contact, even with China. and the Netherlands. They did contact those groups for some trade, but that was the only groups they'd really talked to, and it was in like small, limited situations. And they had a lot of very stable leaders who were doing great things. By the way, the Tokugawa shogunate, a shogun is like a political warlord who kind of runs the emperor, helps make decisions for the emperor. So Japan was forced to open itself up to trade with Western countries eventually. So the Western powers wanted access to trade with Japan. They were kind of just like with China. They were tired of being pushed away and not being accepted as trade partners. And in 1853, Commodore Matthew Perry, not the guy from Friends, but this guy over here in this picture, he was a Commodore in the U.S. Navy. He kind of worked to negotiate some treaties, and what ended up happening was the U.S. had, well, definitely at the time had superior military and technology, so Japan was forced to agree. They were kind of tricked into agreeing to trade with the U.S., and then that kind of did a snowball effect where one thing became another, and they signed treaties with other countries soon after, and Japan had to open up their borders basically. And then you had the Meiji Restoration. So after trade began, Japan set up a brand new government called the Meiji government. And there were several changes that happened during the Meiji Restoration, but basically, um, Meiji gained power. That's this guy. He became the emperor, and he realized that Japan needed to modernize in order to fit in with these Western countries in order to keep up. And so he started adapting Western technology, like building railroads and factories, better roads, trying to become more like the European countries. So for years, they'd had this isolationist idea where they would be completely separate from any other countries. They didn't want to be influenced by other countries. And once Meiji took power, it was like a complete 180, and they were going to do everything. In the process, this ended feudalism. They had this idea of like kind of like you think in the Middle Ages, serfs working for a landowner who then works for the government. And again, it was a caste type system where people are considered higher ranking than others in the social pyramid. This got rid of that. There was a consolidation of military power. They started modernizing their armies and got a stronger army. They used these strengthened armies to start attacking places like China, Korea, Mongolia, and showing their powers. And they ended up fighting and winning a war with Russia over Japan expanding too much. And that was called the Russo-Japanese War in 1904. So this is just kind of the quick synopsis of imperialism in Asia prior to World War I.